right, so good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here. I am Denise Gilman, and I am the co-director of the Immigration Clinic at the University of Texas Law School in Austin, Texas. But I'm also very involved with the ABA, with the Commission on Immigration, and with the section on Civil Rights and Social Justice, specifically the Immigration Committee. And we're really thrilled to be presenting a very timely chair chat on immigration, some of the myths that we are seeing described in the press about migration and migrants, and also really just taking the opportunity to present some counter narratives of some really positive experiences of migrants and professionals who come from a migration background. The Chair Chat is the platform that's designed to bring together legal scholars, advocates, thought leaders, and activists committed to fighting for social justice, protecting our democracy, and upholding the rule of law. And we're trying to share strategies for tackling existing and emerging civil rights issues facing our country. And so that's what we're here to do today. And it is my deep, deep pleasure to introduce and to interview Rebecca Sanchez-Roig. Rebecca was born in Havana, Cuba, and she was mostly raised in the Midwest. She has a BA and an MA in fine arts that she obtained before she went on to do her JD. So of course now she is a very well experienced and expert in immigration law practicing attorney. She was in private practice for quite some time at the same time that she was teaching at the University of Miami Law School. But recently she's taken on a position leading up the legal team, the legal services team for immigration practice at Catholic Charities. So has a deep wealth, has a great depth of experience that she can draw on to help us to understand some of the immigration issues that we are facing today. Thank you again so much, Rebecca, for doing this chat.
Thank you, Denise, for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thanks. So could you just start out by telling us a little bit about your current work, the practice that you've been doing, your new job at Catholic Charities, and your work teaching at the University of Miami?
Sure. So I'll just actually go back a little bit further than that. I actually started as a corporate business and finance lawyer at a major law firm, international law firm. Did that for about 6 or 7 years before I went on to work for the INS and then the DHS as a prosecutor, as an immigration prosecutor. And I became a deputy chief counsel. I was with the prosecutor's office in Miami for 17 years. Before then, I left and opened my own practice and did that for about 10 and a half years, maybe 11. And I was offered this amazing opportunity as a senior managing attorney at Catholic Charities Legal Services in Miami, which I accepted, which is, it's really an amazing opportunity to help vulnerable populations. But at the same time, I also teach business, entertainment, and sports immigration law at the University of Miami. So I'm busy, and I like to be busy. It's a immigration. I call myself a student of immigration law because I'm always learning, which is why I love this practice. And I don't think there's ever a point where you don't learn because of the amount of changes that you see in immigration on a sometimes weekly and monthly basis. That's
fantastic. So it's really amazing to hear about the experience in government as well as in private practice and in legal services, nonprofit legal services. I think that's an amazing perspective to bring to the table. So before we get into some of your views on the discourse that's out there on immigration, tell us a little bit about you and your family. What was your experience of migration to the United States? How old were you? And then how did you and your family get status in the United States?
Well, that's interesting. I was 5 years old when I came to the United States, and my father and brother we didn't come together as a family. We were actually separated. My father and brother were sent to Jamaica on a program that allowed individuals to go to Jamaica, and actually they would enter at some point the US as residents. My mother, sister, and I were not for about 6 or 7 months after my father left. We were then sent to Miami, where a church was going to sponsor us. We were part of a relocation program. We were sent to Miami for about 3 days, a total of about 5 days. The first 3 days we were in a hotel room in Miami. Imagine my very young mom with two little girls, and in a country she only knew from traveling on her honeymoon. And then for about 2 days after that, we had an uncle, my dad's uncle, who had actually just arrived in Miami, and he took us into his place where he was living, which was regrettably a mouse and rat infested room where we were for about a couple of days before then we were resettled in Puerto Rico. Um, in Puerto Rico, my family reunites, and at that point, I don't think we hadn't seen each other for about 8 or 9 months. And my mom tells a story about not recognizing my father when he met us at the airport because he had lost like 50 or 60 pounds. He had lost a lot of his hair, and it wasn't the man who had left Cuba about 8 months or 9 months before. In Puerto Rico, we lived in a guest house, and the guest house was not an easy place for a young family to live with a boy and two little girls. And my brother was very mischievous. And so my brother was always getting into trouble. He was always finding something to do, throwing a rock, doing something. And the guest house was actually owned by the individuals that were to be my uncles. My dad's brother was in Puerto Rico, his future in-laws. But unfortunately, we weren't treated very well in the guest house. They didn't provide food for us. My father was had difficulties trying to get a job in Puerto Rico. And my mom always says that she was very grateful to the housekeeper who would bring us leftovers, and that was what allowed us to eat. At some point, my brother's mischievous ways got the better of the owners, and we were thrown out. And my parents had nowhere to go, so we were on a park bench in San Juan, Puerto Rico, which was even I was probably even though I was a small child, I remember that event because I remember how traumatic it was for my parents. I can still visualize the order we sat in, and two suitcases on either side of one on my dad's side and one on my mom's side. And the order we sat in, I sat next to my dad, who was on my right. My sister sat next to me. My brother sat next to her, and my mother sat at the other end. And you don't forget moments like that in your life. It was traumatic. My father kept saying he didn't know what we would do. But the Lord was good to us because coincidentally, a woman walks by the park who turns out was a member of the church my parents used to attend in Cuba, in Havana. And she was able to bring us to her very small place, and where we were able to sleep in the living room until we were relocated back to Miami by a church that was going to sponsor us and relocate us to Memphis, Tennessee, a few months after that. So it was the first few months of I'd like to say it was just the first few months of our experience as immigrants, as exiles, was difficult, but the experience was difficult for many, many, many years.
And so you came as a family through a relocation plan as refugees, effectively designated as refugees?
Well, actually, it's interesting. My brother and dad actually came in as green card holders. My sister, my mom, and I were paroled in. I didn't get status in the US. I didn't get green card status I was somewhere between 10 and 11 years old before I got my green card. So I spent the first 5 to 6 years in the US without a green card. We came in on different programs, and so that's the way it was. We were relocated to an area. In those days, they allowed, churches would relocate you if they wanted to sponsor a refugee family. And so we were relocated to Memphis, Tennessee. And while, you know, my two of our family members were green card holders, the remaining family members were parolees without knowledge that, you know, we didn't have certain benefits and we didn't have certain protections as a parolee. But
And even then, these were programs that were special for those fleeing Cuba, whereas today, many individuals who might be fleeing similarly dramatic situations, even from Cuba, might not have access to programs such as the ones that your family benefited from and might instead be forced to approach the border and seek asylum there, right?
yeah, indeed, those programs don't exist today. It might be a different story if they did exist, but they didn't exist, and you know, and unfortunately, many churches or individuals that could sponsor you, or entities that could sponsor you, really can't do what was done in those days. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it was complicated.
So tell us a little bit about your life in the Midwest.
Well, so arriving in Memphis, Tennessee, I remember my brother. His church was wonderful. Wellesley. It was Wesley or Wellesley. I can't remember the name of it, but I remember we arrived, and the pastor of the church met us at a bus stop, I guess it was, if I remember correctly. The church had rented an apartment for us. They had, um, you know, there were toys, there was furniture, but for us kids, my brother, my sister, and I, when we first walked into this apartment, the first thing we did, all three of us, was run to the refrigerator, open the refrigerator, and we saw food, and food was huge because we had not had a lot of food. We had, even in South Florida when we were here, we had what they called the refugee center box, which was powdered eggs, powdered milk, peanut butter, Spam, white bread, cereal, and toothbrushes, etc. And we lived in South Florida the summer before we were relocated. We lived in an efficiency of one room with one bed where all five of us slept. We had a hot plate, a bathroom, you know, a little shower, and that's where we lived. And so my mom, whatever came in that refugee box that we had to walk 30, 40, 45 blocks to get, was what we ate. That's it. There was nothing else. My father didn't work at that time. And so arriving in Tennessee and Memphis and seeing this was very shocking for us as children. But it was, but our experience was, I think a lot of it depends on how you look at life and experiences. There were huge struggles. My mom had tremendous difficulties adjusting to life in the US. My mother has always told us that she knew from day one, from the time she was born, she had three truths in her life. She was born, she would die, and her third truth was she would never leave Cuba. And when that truth was no longer a truth, essentially my mother had a nervous breakdown. And I remember years of watching my mother cry, lay in a bed, just cry and cry and cry for her life, the life she had. We buried our grandfather just weeks before we left Cuba. So she buried her father, all the cousins and the aunts and the uncles that we never saw again, the people we could never even talk to because communications didn't exist as they existed today. And I was the middle child. My brother's older. I'm the middle daughter, and my sister was younger. I think that impacted me much more than it impacted my brother. Was sort of oblivious. He was mischievous. He was oblivious to a lot of things. My brother is it's a wonderful human being. but he was very much into his own things. He's one of the deans in the Frost School of Music at the University of Miami. So he was into his world. And then my sister was much younger. And I remember feeling the pain, trying to understand the pain that my mother felt. But what I remember feeling was a sense of like fear, where, you know, my father was working at a university, at a school first, later on a university, and what was going to happen to us? You know, there was this fear. I thought my mother was never going to get out of that bed. I thought my mother would never be a normal mother again. My father worked many jobs. My mom, you know, at first couldn't work. She was fully debilitated. And that for me was very difficult. That was very traumatic, because it it it's not easy to be 5, 6, 7 years old and see a parent like that. You know, we were alone in the US. We had no one else. My dad's mother couldn't come for like 15 years. She wasn't allowed out. My grandmother was allowed out later on, but she was in Miami. So we were literally alone in the Midwest. And
I think
from a family,
it's a really,
yes,
sorry, go ahead.
go ahead. You were saying?
No, I was just gonna mention that your description of your mother's challenge in traveling to the United States just makes me think about the extent to which, for many, for most of the world, migration isn't really a choice. Most people want to stay in their home countries. And even now, with greater mobility around the globe, we only see about 3 to 4% of the world's population migrating, leaving their home country on any kind of permanent basis. And I think that contrasts with the image that is sometimes depicted in the media of the idea that everybody wants to leave home and everybody specifically wants to come to the United States, when the reality is a bit different, that most people don't want to leave home. And even of those who do, coming to the United States is often a necessity rather than really a choice, something they're looking for, and not easy when they do come. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that's true. I don't know an immigrant, a refugee, an exile, because we were exiles. We called ourselves exiles. I don't know one that said, "Oh, I want to leave my country, everything that I have, my life, everything that I have behind, to go to the U.S. and struggle." Not a soul. In fact, quite the opposite was true in my experience. Every year at Christmas, holidays, I would hear somebody say, "Oh, maybe next year in Havana, maybe next year we'll be back in Cuba, maybe next year it'll be something else." The desire to return was huge, and still is huge for many. But no one willingly leaves their country unless you have to leave your country. You can vacation, that's one thing, but to come to a different part of the world, for many, and to know that they're going to struggle and what they're going to struggle against, your suffering, what you're experiencing in your home country is unfathomable, untenable, and that's why you have to leave. It's dangerous.
Thanks for sharing that. So does your immigrant experience, your background, making your way to the United States, struggling to make it here, influence the way you are as a lawyer, the way you practice the law, especially in the immigration realm?
It yeah, not just affects my approach as a professional, but as a human being, because we experienced discrimination. We experienced a lot of issues that the average person doesn't experience. When we lived in Iowa, there were little girls that I had invited to my house. They couldn't eat at my house. They weren't allowed to eat at my house. Their parents thought we would poison them because we spoke a different language. We were different. We wore earrings and we were called barbaric for that. I mean, I've been called a lot of names, but my parents, I have the best parents. I've had the best parents. My father passed a few years ago, but I have wonderful parents because my parents made it an adventure. And we had difficulties, we had difficulties mean, my father worked 4 jobs. We would have to go to some of the jobs with him, sleep on couches because my mom couldn't be alone. So we'd have to come back, first thing in the morning, get ready to go to school. But it was an adventure. And when it's an adventure, my father made sure, and my mom made sure that they taught us that as part of this adventure, our job was to study, to get a great education, to be kind, to be good, to volunteer, to give back, to serve. And so all of these things that happened were painful. I mean, there's no doubt that we have generational trauma. I still hear, and there's some smells and some things that I still experience that throw me back 40 years, 50 years, and put me in not a happy place. But on the other hand, that in my life in America and my life in the Midwest, I have to say that I was privileged because we met some very wonderful people, some amazing Americans that were there to help, neighbors that came that wanted to meet you, neighbors that wanted to learn about you. We wanted to learn about them and they wanted to learn about us. It is quite different from what we see today, where people don't seem to want to learn about each other, where their differences appear to be greater than what they share in common. And let's face it, what we share in common is far and above greater than any difference we have. What we all bleed, and it's one color. We bleed red. Everybody bleeds red. And so we breathe the same airs. We are human beings created from my spirituality, from my faith, in the image and likeness of God. And we share that, right? All human beings. So the people, we met extraordinary people, people that helped us, that helped lift us, right? And so my dad, my mom, us as a family, me in particular, we're talking about that. My job has been to try to help others, to lift others up, to give them an opportunity, to give them the opportunities that I had and then to give greatly back to the country that welcomed us. And which is one of the reasons I went to work for the government. I wanted to give back. I wanted to serve the US. But, between the good, there is also the hard experience of being a refugee, of being an immigrant, and not just culturally, because there are cultural differences, but because you face circumstances that the native born American is never going to have to face.
Or imagine, right? So this is a good segue, actually. So when you hear statements in the press or by political candidates that suggest that migrants are taking U.S. jobs or are a draw on U.S. resources, are receiving public benefits that should instead go to U.S. citizens, what kind of reaction do you have? What do you want the public to know about those kinds of claims?
Migrants are not taking US jobs. Migrants do the jobs US citizens don't want to do. I've said something, I remember telling my son many years ago that for every person that crosses the southern border or any border, there's a lawful permanent resident or a US citizen waiting to employ them. They do the jobs that Americans in this country no longer did. They do the jobs my grandmothers did. My grandmothers picked work, picked strawberries. My grandmothers who had careers in Cuba came to this country and had to do jobs that they never did in Cuba, right? They do the jobs that no one wants to do, because who wants to be under the sweltering sun for 14 hours a day, 12, 14 hours a day, picking corn or picking fruit or picking any type of fruit? The migrants are the people that help put food on the table. We have amazing farmers. The farmers can't do this job alone, and Americans don't want to do it. If you offered an American the opportunity today to do the job that most migrants, nearly all migrants, will do when they come to this country, which is to go out in this Florida sunshine, pick oranges and grapefruits, for $7 an hour. They think you're crazy. But for migrants, this is a livelihood. They're fleeing their countries. They don't have work in their countries. They're fleeing horrific conditions, international criminal groups. They're fleeing communism. They're fleeing dictators. And so the ability to come and help pick fruit, which helps them put their own food on their own tables and support their families, and simultaneously helps us, this is something they're grateful for. Americans should be grateful that we have individuals, people that want to come to this country and do that type of work. I don't think that anybody that I hear today talking about the fact that migrants are taking their jobs has ever sat out in the sun for 12 hours a day and picked crops. I don't think they realize the difficulties of doing that job. And I think that if they thought about it much more and didn't feel the anger that they've been made to feel, they'd be the empathetic person that I know Americans are and can be, and the type of Americans that we met.
Right. And there are so many studies now that show that the economic contributions of migrants to the US economy and society are quite significant. Not that we want to instrumentalize migration and make it only about the benefits, the economic benefits that migrants can bring, but it is important to recognize that reality, that there is pretty serious research that shows that far from undermining the US economy or taking jobs overall, migrants are growing the pie so that everybody has a slightly better opportunity. And if that were to end, that would have a significant negative economic consequence. In other words, if there were mass deportations of any kind, there are a number of studies that show that the economic impacts would be quite severe. In terms of taking benefits, public resources, as a legal matter, of course, most recent migrants don't qualify for any or many benefits, certainly not until refugee status or asylum status has been granted. And then even for many green card holders, they often have to wait for quite a lengthy period of time before they might be eligible for benefits like Medicaid. So there's just a bit of a legal myth out there about migrants drawing from public resources. But also I thought it might be helpful for you to comment on your experience working with clients and your own connections in the migrant community about, sort of what attitudes are by most migrants towards taking public benefits. I kind of have a sense of what my clients usually say, and I'm guessing you'll say something pretty similar.
So first of all, it is illegal for undocumented immigrants to get public benefits, right? They don't get federal or state benefits. And this whole idea that they get federal or state benefits, I think has risen from the fact that when they have children, for example, in the US, who are American-born children, like my own son, the children are allowed to get certain benefits, just like any American child would be allowed to do if they qualify for it, correct? There are standards that the government employs to ensure that the individual qualifies for it. It's not, whenever I hear things like they're lying, they're getting all of these benefits, they're absolutely not lying or getting the benefits. And in fact, the state and federal government is actually pretty good about documenting and ensuring that the individuals that are actually getting the assistance, whether it's Medicaid or SNAP or any other type of assistance program, are actually citizens because in most cases they will have to be citizens and qualify for it from a financial perspective. They have people that clear them. They follow protocols. There's standard operating procedures for this. So it's very easy to demonize an immigrant by saying, you know, oh, you're getting all these federal benefits. I can only imagine people saying, oh, well, you know, Rebecca, you got a federal benefit, you got a box. And in your box, the box that you got of powdered eggs and powdered milk and grape jelly and peanut butter, you were a parolee. You weren't even a resident. Yeah, I got a box, all right. And thank God for the programs that existed that allowed us to get a box to be able to nourish us, because we went forward, my siblings and I, my parents went forward to help many, 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 many people in our community. And our immigrant populations, historically, not just now, look at who we are as a country, right? We have Oktoberfest. We have, you know, we have Chinese restaurants, Japanese restaurants, Mexican restaurants, Korean restaurants, German restaurants, Polish restaurants, Turkish restaurants. We have in St. Louis, where I grew up, there were communities, the most varied communities you could possibly experience, and it was a wonderful opportunity to get to know something different and to eat different foods. These people they built their restaurants, they built their communities. We as immigrant populations have built the US. And you know, as I tell my class when I first start, every year I said, you know, they're the Native Americans. Everyone in this class, every one of us is an immigrant in one way or another, because we have an immigration history to the United States. We know who the natives are, and they're the Native Americans. They're the real Americans. Everyone else has an immigration history, has an amazing immigration history that built cities like New York, Chicago, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Cincinnati. You know, these people aren't taking their children that are born US born citizens may benefit, but they're not taking, they're actually building something. They're building a life and a future, and many restaurants and many businesses. And they're trying to have a life that's safe and secure. They're fleeing conditions that aren't safe and secure, and they're finding safety and security in the United States. So for me, I hear this all the time. This is a common, you know, on the radio in Miami. This is just very common to hear, and I have to dispel them with the facts that this is absolutely not true. And if people read a little bit more than the 30 seconds they read on X or on TikTok, they might actually have an education and they may actually learn something. But unfortunately, many individuals today are getting their news from X or TikTok or Instagram or Facebook, and they're not in the world of researching and fact checking and trying to understand where the truth really lies.
Yeah, and I also find, at least with many people I speak to, that if anything, there's sometimes a challenge to get migrant families to take advantage of benefits that they eventually, after many years, do qualify for, partly because they are very self-reliant and partly because they're nervous about playing into the narrative, and maybe even risking some consequence down the line from the U.S. government, because there are such strict controls on who is entitled to obtain benefits from the federal or state government. So I'm guessing that's been some of your experience as well.
That's absolutely true. If they're eligible for it, many don't want it because they're afraid. They're in the process, for example, of residency, and they're afraid of what's going to happen. Oh, they have asylum applications pending. They think that, you know, somehow it's going to negatively impact them if they take any kind of assistance. And because many of them most have been very self-reliant. It's not like they come from countries where they have governments that help them or assist them. Governments work against them in many countries. They don't have governments that assist them. They have little plots of land where they might, if they're lucky, they can farm for a living, or but other than that, they cook maybe at home, they sell, they peddle what they make, and they don't want to be accused of um, having taken from the government.
And so, last sort of myth question or informational sharing question. Another assertion that's arisen a lot in the media recently is that migrants commit crimes, that it is the case that most migrants are coming with criminal histories already in their home countries, that they then engage in criminal activity in the United States. What do you want the public to know about that?
Well, the reality of it is actually quite the opposite. Migrants are not more likely to commit crimes than people that are born in the US. There is a lot of data out there on this topic. And in fact, it is one of the ways that I grew up hearing many of the ways that Fidel Castro influenced the Cubans in before he came to power, before he took over the country. One of them was by saying, by talking about the levels of crimes, that there would be no crime with the after the revolution. In fact, today you read, and the government in Cuba still saying, no, there is no crime. There is a lot of crime in Cuba, but according to that government, there is no crime. There is crime in every country in the world. Citizens of every race, ethnicity, social group, citizens in every country in the world, many commit crimes. US citizens, in fact, US born citizens, if I remember, if I'm not sure whether it was the University of Wisconsin, there was an article that I read that said that US born citizens were 2 times more likely to be arrested for certain violent crimes than immigrants in this country. 2 times more likely to be arrested for drug crimes than immigrants in this country. They're not. Many, yes, we have crimes committed by immigrants, but they're not the overwhelming number of individuals that are committing the crimes in the US. US citizens and US born citizens commit crimes at greater rates than the immigrants that come to this country. And there are some very good reasons. I mean, there are some very interesting reasons for that. For example, growing up, I remembered fearing if I did something that we got out of line, my brother got out of line, you had to fear, the consequences at home, because to break the law for in a country that had welcomed us was not something that was acceptable. It was not something that my parents would have ever accepted, right? I still hear that. I hear, I hear here at Catholic Legal Services, I hear the parents talk about it. They sit in my office and they talk about, how certain things are absolutely not acceptable to them. And there's no reason, nothing has given, there's no information, there's no data that gives you certainty or any kind of assurance that when people migrate not just to the US but to any other country in the world, that the first thing they're going to do is commit crimes. And I hear this frequently. I hear this regrettably. I've heard these comments from people that I know that are friends, and I've heard comments about how jobs are being taken over. It's what we've discussed here, but none of that is true. And the problem is that no one wants to do the research that's necessary because they don't want to have their minds changed. They want to believe what they want to believe because they feel somehow disenfranchised. they feel that only they are entitled to whatever we have in America and that nobody else should be entitled to it. So regardless of the attempt that you might make to want to change their minds, and they don't want to, they don't want to do, you can, you can, you can show them the statistics and they'll tell you those aren't true. And that was something that I remember hearing growing up from my parents, where they, they would say, well, Fidel, here are the statistics. Fidel Castro says it's not true. And if Fidel Castro said it wasn't true, then it wasn't true. So now we have people that in my mind are hypocritical, fearful, morally bankrupt, and anti-American individuals that make these blatant, unfounded statements. And if you correct them, well, that's not true because it's true because I said it's true. The facts don't matter to some people. And it's a new way of life that we have to get used to in America, or find a way to be able to rein back in so that facts do matter. Because factually, immigrants are not committing crimes at higher rates than native-born citizens. They're not taking their jobs. They're not taking the federal benefits. There is no swarm. There is no invasion at the southern border. We have people at the southern border that are coming in. The southern border is not open. We have 20,000. This country has about 20,000 officers working at the southern borders. We have good people working. There's technology working there. If the southern border were open, if such a thing could exist, there's miles and miles and miles and miles of fences and barriers. I think that most people don't realize what it is and what's really happened, because number one, they haven't seen it, and number two, they just choose to believe certain circumstances and certain facts because they're unhappy. They've lost their jobs in the 80s and the 90s when America outsourced work to other countries, and didn't reskill our workers in the US. And anger has festered for many years. And when anger festers, it allows people to be able to lie to you, and you buy into those lies and that deception, believing that those are actually facts.
Well, while I agree that it is sometimes hard to confront people with hard statistics, I think one thing that does seem to work is to humanize the immigration experience. And so I think that's exactly what you've done today, both by sharing your own experience and the experiences of your clients and many other migrants that you know in the community. And so that is incredibly important work and perspective. And I want to thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thank you, Denise, for having me. I appreciate it. Have a nice day. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.